Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
It is my honor to introduce our speaker this morning. JoelGÇÖs is the founder and chief executive officer of the School of One. It's part of the New York City Department of Education and an advanced program that he'll be speaking about today. Before I explain more about that, I'll briefly give you some background about Joel's previous experience. He was the chief executive for human capital at the New York City Department of Education. He also, before that, was the general manager for Edison Schools and ran their after-school division there and had a lot of impact on that program. Before that, 14 years in education, teaching for the AmeriCorps, as well as general counsel, administrator for school operations. Obviously has been around the block a few times and understands what the needs are in this area. He received his bachelor degree from Tufts University and then his law degree from the University of Miami School of Law. As mentioned, Joel will be focusing his talk today on the School of One, what's been accomplished so far, and where he thinks it ultimately will go. He'll touch upon some of the areas and how he can see Microsoft playing a role and some of the personalized learning aspects and what Microsoft can do. And one last piece of information that wasn't on the written agenda is that Time Magazine just named the School of one of the top 50 inventions of 2009. And it's the first time ever that an educational program has received one of these awards. So, big round of applause, please, for JoelGÇÖs.
Thank you, Michael, for inviting me here. I'm going to step out here a little bit. And thanks to Microsoft for being interested in School of One. I should mention from the beginning that when School of One was just a PowerPoint, Rich Seidner and Chris Hollander have been partners in this from the very beginning. And none of this would have happened without the support of Microsoft, really believing in the idea and helping it come to be. So I want to begin with a picture. And it's a picture of a classroom in the 1800s in the middle of Wisconsin. And if we think about, and I don't have to tell this group, what has changed in our society over the last 200 years since this picture has been taken in virtually every other industry in the world. This should look eerily familiar to what is today. Now, this model of putting one teacher and 28 kids in a room or so was great back then. And it worked back then because we weren't really trying to educate every student in the room. We didn't have to. We just needed to educate the elite and give everybody else a little bit of exposure to reading and math before they took jobs in manufacturing. And this was good enough to lead the industrialized world. And then in 1983, something happened. The Department of Education, under President Reagan at the time, put out a report called A Nation at Risk, which was the alarm bell that this wasn't working. Our schools were failing. Our once unchallenged preeminence in commerce, industry, science, and technological innovation is being overtaken by the competitors throughout the world. The educational foundations of our society are presently being eroded by a rising tide of mediocrity that threatens our very future as a nation and as a people. Now, since 1983, it is actually extraordinary. I looked back and tried to figure out what did we do since 1983 to fix this? And the answer is actually quite a bit. We increased our per pupil spending by over 50% adjusted for inflation. We increased average teacher salaries by 24% adjusted for inflation. We reduced our student-teacher ratios in the elementary and secondary level. We attracted billions in philanthropic and investment capital. We've seen the introduction of powerful third-party organizations like Teach for America. invested hundreds of billions of dollars in training our teachers. We adopted more rigorous standards for graduating high school in all 50 states. And we've adopted a number of private sector initiatives like choice, merit pay. And after all of this, 25 years, this is what we've got. Hasn't worked. These are the NAEP scores, the National Assessment for Educational Progress, which is known as the nation's report card in reading. And you can see our 17-year-old scores, our 13-year-old scores, and our 9-year-old scores have been basically flat since 1983, if not before. And in math, the story is much the same. A little bit of a tick, 9-year-old math. But when you think about the investment we put in and the returns that we got, there's no comparison. We haven't succeeded. Hasn't been for lack of trying, but the reality is we're not anywhere near where we need to be. Now, that hasn't stopped the press from rightly beating us up at every opportunity. Every 5 years, when it's some anniversary of a nation at risk, there are the stories, the nation is still at risk, clueless in the classroom, U.S. school reforms fall short. There's no question that we've identified the problem and we want to fix it. Question is, what do we do? And while we have been essentially flat, we've been passed by other countries. The U.S. 15-year-olds are now 24th out of 29 OECD countries in math, slightly better in literacy. We're number 15. And in science, our 15-year-olds ranked 21 out of 30 OECD countries in science. When it comes to high school graduation, we're not doing much better. You see all the countries, including Japan and Belgium and the Czech Republic, who have higher graduation rates than we do. And even among those who graduate, the numbers of students who graduate high school and need to take remedial education classes while in college is extraordinary. Aside from this global achievement gap, there is also a morally reprehensible and economically destructive racial and ethnic achievement gap in this country. African American, Native American, and Hispanic Americans are far less likely to graduate high school than their Asian or white counterparts. The average 17-year-old African American reads at about the same level as the average white 13-year-old and computes at roughly the same level. Of the 1 million African American and Latino students who enter 10th grade, only 2.5% earn a master's degree. Now you might think, well, after all this investment, at least maybe the teachers are happy. At least maybe we've taken care of the adults. But actually we haven't done that either. This study just came out recently from Public Agenda. 40% of teachers classify themselves as disheartened, 30% contented, 23% idealist. And of those that are disheartened, they are more likely to give their principals a poor rating or express concern about the working conditions in our schools. The contented teachers are very happy with their working conditions. They tend to be in the types of schools that we might send our children to, in middle or high-income schools. And 23% consider them idealists. These, of course, are the teachers that are still there, to say nothing of the ones that left. Nearly half of all teachers we as a nation hire every year are gone 5 years later. This is true in New York City, and it's true around the country. The attrition rates in U.S. education are much higher than in non-teaching professions around the country. So when we look back at the last 25 years, if anything, we know from a research perspective what doesn't correlate to student outcomes. We know that increased spending, reducing class size, more training, the ability of teachers to unionize, enrolling in charter schools, private schools, voucher schools, teacher quality as measured by whether you have a master's degree, whether you have a certification, how you came into the profession. None of these things in any meaningful way correlate to the outcomes that students get. So big swing and a miss over the last 25 years. So where are we today? Well, where we are today is a general belief that perhaps our mistake over the last 25 years is we've done all of these things in a way that just were cascaded on top of an existing flawed model. One teacher, 28 kids in a room. After everything we've done, it looks the same today as it did back then. Maybe there's 3 computers in the back of the room. Maybe instead of a green chalkboard, there's a whiteboard, or maybe even a smart board for some of you who've seen those in schools. But by and large, the basic model we have for delivering instruction today hasn't changed. What has changed are the circumstances around it. We didn't have to educate all these students because a lot of them were going to had manufacturing jobs waiting for them when they graduated. Those jobs are gone. And to expect this model to deliver individualized instruction for everyone is a myth. It just doesn't happen. We have not innovated, and what's interesting is that the data on this bears that out. This was a study done by the Department of Commerce in 2002. They looked at every industry in the country, and they measured the ratio of IT investment to people, because there's a very strong correlation between productivity and investment in IT. So telephone and telegraph had a ratio of 23 times the national average and had a corresponding increase in productivity growth. Educational services was at the very bottom of the list, 0.06 of the national average investment in innovation. I have to check the list a little bit closer to see if armed services are there. I'm not sure. Couple of just examples of this, and take the 2 largest industries in the country, education and healthcare. I looked this up just before the meeting. $2.2 trillion of spending in healthcare with 5 million employees. Education, at least K-12, $500 billion industry, almost 8.5 million employees. We are an incredibly people-intense business, and it's been that way for the last 200 years. The Department of Education in New York City, where I work, has roughly a $22 billion budget. 85% is on people. We've never rationalized the balance between people and non-people expenses. So why has this happened? Why have we not innovated in K-12 education? Why is it you never hear the words education and innovation in the same sentence? Well, I think there are a few reasons. One reason is school districts just haven't done it. When you've got school boards and superintendents and very tight budgets, generally speaking, most of your money goes into labor contracts. And the idea of putting any dollars to the side for long-term investment is just something that's been anathema to how school district budgets operate. 2, we have been really bad at making this an attractive investment opportunity for you all and for the rest of the private sector. There are 15,000 school districts in this country. School boards can be extremely political. The sales cycle can be very long. And it's just not easy to sell into school districts. And it's a shame. I have a 4-year-old son who has learned how to read by watching videos made by Leapfrog. I don't know if any of you have kids. You've seen them. They're just terrific, right? The Letter Factory is great. So I went to Leapfrog. Why isn't this in our schools? And the very quick answer is it's much easier to just go into Amazon or go into Walmart than it would be to sort of blow through 15,000 bureaucracies and get this into classrooms. So they just don't do it. It makes perfect sense. Third, there's been a reluctance on the part of the logical innovators, that being the educational publishers, to deviate from their current delivery model. Now, part of that is obviously they have a vested interest in textbooks, but part of it is if they innovate too much, they don't necessarily have willing customers that want to innovate. So they would take big risks the more they innovate, that they would lose market share to their competitors. We haven't seen much movement there, although I think that is beginning to change. Fourth, innovations outside of education have not penetrated the classroom workflow. This is what's happened time again. I think the large-scale innovators, particularly in technology but otherwise, have developed products that are horizontal products that education is viewed as a vertical. So here's some, kids can make movies, get that in classrooms. Kids can do this, get that in classrooms. And so we have this model where we are trying to put existing products and services into a model that's not ready for them. I taught 5th grade for 3 years. I remember to this day, one day, out of nowhere, my door opened. Guy walked in and said, "I'm here with your 3 computers. Where would you like them?" Put them in the back of the class. Thanks. Great. Now, how as a teacher, how do I integrate that into my day? I've got 28 kids. I can put 3 kids on the computer, but then I got to figure out what they're doing and what are the other 25 kids doing, and then how do those go back there, and then what if one breaks down, then I got to go fix it. And it just was too much hassle to actually integrate those computers into my day, and I think that's true with a lot of innovations that we think have strong educational value, but they don't quite fit into the grammar of how classrooms typically operate. And then finally, to innovate in education, you need real schools and students to test and refine innovations. It's not like software where you can, you don't need that, or even if you're building military jets, you can fly them around in the desert before you sell them to the government. To do this, particularly to penetrate classroom workflow, you've got to have some live ammunition, and typically innovators don't necessarily have that. That's why I think there are many other reasons. I think those are some of the bigger reasons. But now this is all about to change, that we are about to move to a whole new era where I think education and technology are going to come to a place that is mutually beneficial. On the demand side, there is a widespread belief that our current delivery model is severely limited, based on, I think, all the data that you saw prior. And we're getting crushed with our budgets. State and local governments seeing massively declining tax revenues. If you are the superintendent or chief financial officer of a school district and you've got these big shortfalls, the only lever you have is to fire teachers. And under the union rules, you fire teachers in order of seniority, meaning you may have some great teachers who came into the profession 2 or 3 years ago, and you may have to lay off 2 or 3 of them in order to keep one veteran. The model doesn't make sense. Just putting 3 or 4 more kids in a class is not going to change the model. So this is an opportunity. People are asking, how can we do more with less? And on the supply side, the feds are now interested in this. They've announced a new federal innovation fund. It's called I3. It's starting off with $650 million and a requirement for a 20% match of the private sector to invest in new ways of delivering instruction. They have come out and said, we want to make education an economically attractive investment on the part of the private sector so we can bring these kinds of innovations that we have thwarted for the last 200 years into our classroom. The USDOE has also signified that the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, this is basically 9% of all US education spending that comes from the federal government, will incorporate lots of investment in further innovations. These 2 things, the demand and the supply, are leading to something we're going to learn more about called HLEs. I thought for a moment that, and I didn't invent this term, that HLEs would be the last 3 letters of an acronym that hadn't yet been claimed by, by anyone, but sure enough, human life expectancy beat us to the punch. But hybrid learning environments. How can we think about hybrids of people and technology that can provide a learning experience for students that's more effective than our existing model? And if we could figure out what these things are and how they work, we can begin to move away from a model, which is what we currently have, where technology is effectively optional. I did not have to use those 3 computers in the back of my class, to a model where it becomes essential, where innovators and schools are working to solve core business problems together, where we think about technology in a classroom in the same way we think about technology in a cockpit. It's not an option. You can't just decide you don't want to fly without that autopilot thing. It is part of the job. So this is the basis that we enter the conversation with School of One. What is a core business problem? I don't have a technology background. And at the beginning, our team didn't either. We brought that in. But we did have a very good sense for what some of the core problems are in classrooms. And one of them has to do with the challenge of individualizing instruction for a class of students. This is real data from a teacher who teaches 7th grade in the Bronx. She is an Ivy League graduate. She works 80 hours a week. She's been to the homes of most of her students. She wants to teach in low-income communities, but this is the kind of teacher that we would all want our children to be in her class. Based on our analysis of all the student test scores, she would place in the 70th percentile in New York City, one of our stronger teachers. She walks in the first day, and in New York State, students are assessed on a 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 being the highest, 1 being the lowest. And she walks in, and this is what she sees. She's got some students who are one who's a high 1, some low 2s, a bunch of high 2s, some 3s, and an almost 4. A couple who are special education, some who are LEP, limited English proficiency, some who used to be limited English proficiency. And her charge, her job, is basically to get all of these students to proficiency by the end of the year. And on top of the academic variability, we have real stories about her students. And she can tell you these stories, as can any teacher in New York City. One teacher cries all the time but loves to read, is a level 2. Another student's very shy, doesn't have any friends, hates to work in groups. Another loves to teach other kids, very strong in groups, is a level 3. She's got one that reads the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal every day, but is truant. Another who tested at the 10th grade level. How in the world can anybody possibly meet the needs of all these students? And by the way, this is just 10 students of 25, and this is just one class period out of 5. The percent of math teachers in New York City, 8th grade math teachers, who get 80% of their kids to proficiency by the end of the year is 13%. The percent that get 1 year's worth of growth out of 80% of the students is 12%. Now, you may think, well, you've got to get better teachers. We have 6 applicants for every teacher we hire. We're in a city where lots of people in their 20s want to go to the big city to teach. We pay pretty well. We have done so much to attract talent into our classrooms. The job is too hard. We just can't expect any one teacher to meet the needs of each kid. I'll take questions at the end. Let me just get a little bit further along. Okay? These are the results. Okay? So remember, this is the teacher in the 70th percentile. Each bar represents a student in that one period. And the red line represents their outgoing test scores. So if the red line touches the top of the bar, as it does right there, it means that that one student made exactly 1 year's worth of growth. Okay? So you see here, these students made more than a year. This student made less than a year. These students made less than a year. You look at it and you go, eh. This is what a great teacher can deliver. And we can't have enough of these. But what often happens is this student, even if she made gains this year, the next year, if she doesn't have a great teacher, those gains are going to get washed away. And that's why we would argue these flat NAEP scores are what they are, because the system is designed to deliver what it is, in fact, delivering. In the end, what this comes down to is a question of time. When you have a teacher who's got to deliver instruction to a classroom full of students, how much time does each student get learning exactly the skill they're ready to learn and in a way that would work best for them? If you ask most teachers, they would give you a number, the ones I've talked to, somewhere in the 5 to 10% range. And it's because we have this model today where we have all of the individual students on one end. We know there's lots of ways, lots of resources that can be put in front of these students to help them to learn, or students can interact with to help them learn. But we have the teacher who is effectively the regulator connecting these two things. Good teachers, this is wider. Bad teachers, this is narrower. But at the end of the day, even for a great teacher, this is going to be too narrow a filter. How can we move away from this industrial batch model of instruction to one that looks more like this? What we thought we needed to do was a very simple concept, was to view live teacher-led instruction as one way, perhaps the best way, but not the only way kids can learn. Kids can learn online, kids can learn in groups, kids can learn by themselves. And if we integrate other modalities into the classroom experience, we can do two things that just can't be done in this old model. First, we can begin to personalize instruction on the basis of academic need. So when I taught, I remember teaching 28 kids how to add fractions. There were 8 of them who still didn't really know what a fraction was. This happens in every classroom across the country. Teacher will say, well, meet me before school, meet me after school. Don't worry about it, you'll eventually get it. The curriculum will spiral back around, Well, now you can give those kids instructional content on what a fraction is. They don't necessarily need to be with the live teacher in order to get the content they need. Otherwise, we've just wasted an hour of their time trying to teach them something they're not ready to learn. The second thing is we can begin to individualize instruction on the basis of the modality itself, how kids best learn. Kids who like working by themselves or with technology can spend more time with those modalities. Kids who like working in groups can spend more time in those modalities. It doesn't mean we have a kid spend all day on a machine or all day with a live teacher. It just means that the balance, how we mix those modalities can vary depending on what we know works best for each student. That was the idea, integrating modalities into classrooms to personalize instruction. And the question for us was, okay, well, how do we do it? And as much as we love working in PowerPoint, we want to get out of PowerPoint as quickly as we could and actually do something. So we went out and found a school in New York City, and we said, we got this crazy idea, we got personalized instruction, integrate these modalities. Can we just do it in your school this summer? Yeah, it's summer school, low stakes. It'll be a voluntary program. Principal said, great, let's give it a shot. So we started working over really seriously. We planned from March to May and then started really in earnest May 11th in preparation for the summer program. And we began with the foundation for individualized instruction, which is what we call learning progression, the discrete set of skills that a student must learn. Now, I should back up and say, to do this, we only want to do this in one subject, math. Let's sort of reduce the barriers wherever we can, and only in one grade, students who are going into the 7th grade. So even though we had students going into the 7th grade in math, just because you're going into the 7th grade doesn't mean you have all the 5th grade skills and all the 6th grade skills. This is the sort of implicit assumption that we're finally challenging. So we developed a learning progression that started back at the 5th grade and worked all the way through the 7th grade. It had 77 skills. One of them was identify the radius, diameter, chords, and central angles of a circle. These standards came from the state of New York. We modified them a little bit, but this became the anchor for our initial School of One pilot. Then what we did was we looked at the data we had on each student that signed up for the program. I mentioned the school has 215 6th graders. We opened it up to all of them. 90 of them signed up. 80 of them showed up. Those were our kids. We looked at all the data we had, administered another assessment, and based on that data, we created a playlist for each student. Some students' playlist was all 5th grade content. Some was all 7th grade content. Some was 5th, 6th, and 7th. No 2 students in the program had the same exact playlist. So culled from the master list of 77, each student had roughly 15 skills. And then what we did was we administered some surveys. We surveyed each student and asked them how they'd like to learn, what their interests were, how they'd like to express themselves. We also surveyed each parent, and we surveyed each teacher about each student. Tell me about this kid. What is she like? What is she interested in? All those little things that were in the bubbles before, we actually tried to put them in a system. And that gave us an initial hypothesis of the types of lessons that would work best for each kid. Maybe right, maybe wrong. But if the kid says I like games, mom says the kid likes games, teacher said this kid likes games, we're going to start off with games, and we'll see how it goes. Now, I should mention, when I say in our system, as my colleagues from Microsoft can tell you, our system was like Excel and Access. We had no system. This was all bubblegum and Scotch tape to get this off the ground. So this gave us a profile of each student. But having a profile is one thing. You need content to actually make this work. So if Frank likes games and needs to learn about area of a triangle, we need a game involving area of a triangle, times 80 kids, times 77 skills, and then if you bombed it one day, you got to have another game the next day. So we needed over 1,000 lessons. And so we went to the content providers, publishers, software providers, big, small, game makers, online content, offline content. And we got as much middle school math stuff as we possibly could, and tagged over 1,000 lessons and put that data into our system. This is a good lesson for kids who like music or games or sports or art, whatever the case may be. Put all that in. And then the last piece was we created something that we called the learning algorithm. Now, usually when I give this presentation, I have to explain what a learning algorithm is. This is probably the one audience that I don't, but I need to practice anyway. So the best way we explain the learning algorithm is at the airport. When we go to the airport, we know that there are certain planes that only fit at certain gates. There are weather problems in different cities. There are crews that under the rules have to be at certain places at certain times. The technology takes all that information, and when we go to the airport, we look up at the monitor and we see the status of our flight and the gate. Same concept here. Our algorithm took all the data about each student, all the data about the content we had, and created a unique schedule for each teacher and each student each day that changed based on how they did the previous day. So a day in the life of a student may be, let's say she was working on area of a triangle. She may start off with a live instructional lesson taught by Mrs. Jones, just like we're all used to. Then she may do some software, had a break, then would do some type of group project, and then maybe have a virtual tutoring session. And then when that was all done, she would take a test just on that skill. And then went home, because it was summer school, and it was half day. When we got the results of that assessment, we were able to do 4 things. 1, let's look at the performance to determine whether or not she should move to the next skill on the playlist. 2, update the profile. She said she liked games. We keep giving games content. She keeps bombing the assessment. Let's dial back the games ranking. 3, let's go back to the content providers. Hey, McGraw-Hill, your decimals lessons are doing great. Your fractions lessons, not so great. Or they're doing great with kids who are special ed. Or they're doing great with girls who are African American. Whatever the case may be, we can begin to give them data on the quality of their content that they've never had before, and can ultimately create a marketplace where instead of buying textbooks, we buy lessons. And we reward them on the basis of how effective those lessons are. And then finally, over time, the system can get smarter. We can learn about patterns and what types of sequences of lessons work best for which types of kids. As we get 5, 10, 50, 100,000 kids, we can say, oh, I've seen the kid who likes sports and music and needs to learn area of a triangle. We start off with the virtual tutoring, and then we do this Pearson lesson, and then we go here, and then we go here. That tends to work more than others. Let's start with that assumption. So this was our solution. This is what we cooked up. And we also decided that we had to change how we think about teachers and people. So we did 4 different things that aren't done in typical schools. First is we changed the way in which teachers were responsible for different pieces of the learning progression. So typically, if you teach math, you work your way through 77 skills, day 1, day 77. Give your tests, you're done. Some kids pass, some kids fail. I taught, I did my job. Here what we did is we said each of the 4 teachers we had in the program were responsible for only 25% of those skills. You were the adding fractions guy. You were the circumference of a circle teacher. Whatever the case may be, they specialized in 17 or 18 skills that became their expertise. And they had different kids that would come to them on different days for that expertise. And so teachers could do their area of a triangle lesson, get the data back, and then change it the next day based on that information. Very different human capital model than what's typical. Second is we recruited 4 student teachers to serve as teacher residents. Now, the typical way we train teachers is they can sit in the back of the room, watch a teacher teach. Eventually, they get thrown into the fire and they teach themselves. That was my experience. But we said, maybe a student teacher should start with just small group instruction and tutoring. Those are good modalities that are good starter modalities. Then we can look at the data, and if they're effective in those modalities, maybe they will ultimately graduate up to more sophisticated modalities like delivering large group instruction to classrooms of students. Third, each teacher got 1 week of planning time before the program began to develop their live lessons. So a teacher may say, look, you're going to send me the night before, tell me what my schedule is, I'll have no time to prepare those lessons. But because we gave them a week's worth of planning time, we said, okay, come up with your 17 or 18 kick-butt lessons on these skills, put them on the shelf, and when we send you your email the day before saying, tomorrow you're going to teach area of a triangle, you can take it off the shelf and do it. And then finally, daily reports. Teachers got every day that assessment data. So they knew how effective their lessons were or how much students were learning and were able to take more ownership over the learning process. This was an example of something that we called the duffel bag. Each teacher, these were the skills that they were each responsible for, and we would give them a 5-day forecast. We'd say to this teacher, here are the skills based on the probabilities that are most likely to come up in the next week. So you really want to make sure you're ready to go. If your lesson on 7N1 isn't quite ready, don't worry about it. It's not going to come up for a while. There's no student whose playlist has that coming up anytime soon. So this gave teachers more information so they felt more prepared when they got their schedules. And then finally, the types of reports that we used, again, very basic type reports, but this was the intent of these reports. Mrs. Young, one of the skills she's responsible for is 5N2, comparing and ordering numbers through the millions. These are the 12 students or so that have that skill anywhere on their playlist. Of those, some of whom, like this one and this one, haven't had any instruction in that skill. They haven't gotten there on their playlist. So Mrs. Young isn't worried about those. If they've got a 0, no problem. Now, we call this a par 6. What this means is we think the average student, it should take 6 lessons to learn this particular skill. One student, Joe Smith, had 4 lessons, took an assessment, got 100%, mastered it, and is -2, is 2 ahead of the pace. This student, 10 lessons, has bombed 3 assessments, is now 4 over. Now, as a teacher, I can really zero in and say, who are the students that are struggling on which skills, and how can I make sure they're getting the instruction they need? It allows the teacher to really focus their efforts on the students who need that instruction most. You can see some students, this student may have had 2 lessons, master the assessment. These 2 lessons may not have even been live instruction lessons. She did a couple things online, she's got it, she's moving on. Great. As a teacher, even though I didn't teach that skill, she's learned it, and that's my job. Very different model. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a 7-minute video that will show you what this looks like.
I've been a teacher for 5 years, and I think one of the biggest challenges that a teacher faces in a traditional classroom is having to deal with the different learning styles, as well as differentiating instruction so that they can reach out to all the different students in their one classroom.
The mission of School of One is to provide students with personalized, effective, and dynamic classroom instruction so that students learn in ways that are customized to their academic needs and learning styles.
We began by just asking ourselves questions like, what subjects do we want to do this in? How long are the periods going to be? Or where are students going to put their backpacks? In the end, we had over 600 questions that served as our roadmap for getting to our summer pilot. We wanted to do this in one school, in one subject, for one grade, in one space, and in a school that already had one computer for every student.
Kicking off here at MS 131, 96 grade students enrolled in the first School of One program that would focus exclusively on math. It's one of 7 middle schools in New York City that was both hosting a summer program in 2009 and had a 1-to-1 ratio of computers to students.
So when I first heard it, I'm like, wait a minute, can that be done? So I was actually very excited at this idea that, okay, if we put a pilot program at MS 131, would you willing to try it? And of course I will. Who won't?
The team began by carefully analyzing assessment data for each student in the program. Based on that analysis, the team identified the most appropriate set of skills that each would focus on during the summer. This is called the playlist. But it was only the beginning of the process.
In order to gain a clear picture of the whole student, they took a lot of surveys, and a lot of this information went into their profile, from the data from their assessments, how well they did on the math tests, to personal surveys about likes and dislikes both in and outside the classroom. And all of these things were put together to form a profile.
As the assessment team developed each student's individual playlist and learning profile, the content team began to source learning activities from several different partners. Lessons are offered through large group instruction, small group instruction, one-on-one tutoring, virtual teaching online, collaborative group activities, and educational software. By the first day of the program, over 1,000 lessons were in the system and ready for deployment. Figuring out how to match each student's profile to the most effective instructional content and in a way that worked inside a classroom was the most challenging part of the School of One pilot.
What makes this program special is the sort of the undergirding technology behind the program, which is this learning algorithm, which basically takes multiple data points from students and from teachers and from parents about students and comes out with basically an optimal learning schedule for each student each day.
So what the learning algorithm does is it looks at it from a different angle. So it says, you know, James really likes to learn using basketball examples, and he is a really good, you know, he likes to learn visually. So we're able to take specific lessons that are catered to James and give them to him.
The learning algorithm generates a unique schedule for each student each day that is projected on monitors located throughout the space. With the profile, the content, and the learning algorithm in place, the final challenge was working through all of the operations for the summer pilot. The School of One team worked with some of the country's top architects on the space requirements for both the summer pilot and for fitting within existing sites. Now it was time to convert the architectural renderings into plans. On July 6, 2009, School of One officially launched. Students received an orientation to explain how School of One worked, learned how the space was organized, and received their own playlist. Each day, the process got easier and easier.
My job last year was to check on the students' acuity scores, to try to figure out which performance indicators need to be taught, to assess them afterwards to figure out what they know, to plan the instruction, to provide the materials, and then to do the actual instruction. As a teacher today, what I experienced was being able just to focus on the delivery of instruction.
Being a graduate student and a teacher-to-be, this is a perfect first place to start. I can actually have an opportunity in a smaller group to gauge reaction.
By taking away the staging and the prep work and a lot of the planning decisions that are made, you know, based on data, what you're doing is you're freeing up the teacher to do what they're here for and what they do best and what they love doing, which is just teach. And you know, the feedback from them has been really positive.
Math is kind of not my strongest subject, and it is hard, and being in this program I noticed has helped me improve in my math, my division and everything else. I think that will be helpful in the future.
I really do think I'm getting better in math because like my adding's getting better and my division and my fractions are getting way better than it used to be.
I think the idea is very grandiose. It's such an exciting and innovative way of teaching. It's the new generation of teaching. I mean, my biggest question is how come this hasn't happened before?
None of this matters if we don't deliver student outcomes. That's the ultimate barometer of success. We are just at the very beginning stages of learning about mass customization of student learning. But we do need a bit of time to figure this out. I know we're not going to have the answers after a 20-day summer program. We are incredibly excited about what we're going to learn from the School of One pilot and the results that we'll see, but even more excited now that we know what we know about where this can go. So I'll show you a little bit about the results, and then we can open it up to questions. So this chart here, down the side was every student, across the top was every skill in our learning progression. Roughly the first 25% of skills were 5th grade skills. The next 50% were 6th grade skills. The last part were 7th grade skills. Now, it's interesting to us, even before the first day of the program, all of these students were being promoted into the 7th grade. But the gaps they had in 5th and 6th grade skills were just enormous. This happens all the time. Big reason why students fall further and further behind. The red was the skills that were on their playlist where they got 0 out of 3 on their pretest. Orange was 1 out of 3, and yellow was 2 out of 3. So this basically made up each student's playlist going across. When the program was done, we gave each student a pretest just on the skills on their playlist. So no 2 students had the same pretest because no 2 students had the same playlist. And then they took a post-test 60 hours of instruction later, and here were the results. The scores went from 42 to 70. The average student mastered 6 new skills and showed improvement on an additional 2. And the pretest went from 42 to 70. Now, of course, the question is, well, what does that compare to? The answer is we don't know yet. There was not a comparable summer school program with similar kids. We view this as, we're still trying to build the train while flying it. Build the plane while flying it, I should say. I guess the train you could do as well, but it'd be fun to do that, fly a train. In the next round, which I'll talk a little bit about, we'll actually have more controls in place, and we'll be able to really understand more and more about how effective the model is. But certainly from a directional standpoint, we were pleased with what we saw. What do the teachers think? By and large, teachers were very happy with the program. We had 4 teachers from the school and then 4 NYU students that were, we call teacher residents. Now, you might think that, and this was both of them, it's combined. You might think that it would be the newer, younger teachers that would really like this more because it was more tech-focused and the more senior ones wouldn't. It was the exact opposite. That the more senior teachers, all the teachers from the school were all out here and here. It was the ones that came out of education school that were told, you're going to have a classroom with 28 kids and 4 walls, and it's going to be your kingdom. They came in, and 2 of them loved it. 2 of them, they wanted the old model. But the teachers in the program, they had 3 pieces of feedback that were all different and all positive. One said, I love the fact that I get data every day, and I can change my lesson the next day based on data the previous day. It completely changes the level of professionalism. Second said, what I like is when I'm teaching a lesson to, and the class size was like 7 kids, because once you have some kids online and some kids doing this and some kids doing that, live instruction is a very small group. And I'm teaching 7 kids, 8 kids, and I know every one of those kids has all the precursor skills required for me to teach whatever I'm teaching, because that's where they're on their playlist. They can move much more quickly, cuts down on behavior problems. Third teacher says what she loves is she just loves to teach, and she could just spend her time on the 17 or 18 kick-butt lessons and constantly improve her craft at the delivering of the live instruction. So all different comments, but all positive, and in many ways I think we improved the quality of their professional experience. And then the kids loved it too. Now this was a voluntary middle school summer program, so it's not exactly not exactly a captive audience. We had over a 90% attendance rate. They loved going to school every day. I mean, at least almost 80% of them did, which is pretty good. They liked learning math from teachers just about as much as learning math from a computer. Actually, this number this is a typo. This should actually say 96%. We have a little typo there, but it was very, very close. And what was most interesting to us about this chart was the lowest number here, this number right here. Almost 2/3 of the students liked taking a test every day. I mean, just think about it for a second. We keep hearing too much testing. Our view is students like tests if they can show off something that they know. What they don't like is to take tests on something that's 2 grade levels beyond them and they feel stupid. So the whole experience of getting assessment data back and getting immediate feedback was something that they really liked. And then, of course, we got a great recognition from Time as one of the best inventions of 2009. We were thrilled with this. But in a way, it was a bit astonishing that after all of the decades of research that had come out of academic institutions and the work that publishers and others have had to sort of work on education innovation, it was a team of 12 working over basically 2 to 4 months to make this list. It just sort of highlighted the gap between all the work we could have been doing and the work that we did. So we have got a lot of questions to answer, but here are some of the biggest ones. How do we gauge the effectiveness of individual lessons for kids? How do we create an open marketplace for lessons and/or assessment items? I should say one of the things we're going to be doing going forward is working with a Microsoft research-funded initiative called the Games for Learning Institute out of New York University. They're going to be creating games that are aligned to our learning progression. And then we're going to be able to go back to them and give them data on how effective those games were so they can improve their knowledge of what makes for effective instructional games. How does the role of teachers change? Maybe instead of teachers, we have large group instructors and small group instructors or mentors. We don't think of this sort of one-size-fits-all model. How does it change the school schedule? How do parents access this information? If you're a parent, you probably get your kid comes home with a test saying, I got a C on my fractions test. We're on to decimals. You get all this lagging information. How do we sort of move that up and let parents know what skills their students are working on and how they can help them with those particular skills? How do we modify the existing physical space to support the model? Very important part of what we're doing. We met with a number of architects this past week. We want to knock down walls and create the math center and the science center in big open places where students can move on their own individualized paths. How can parents become more invested in the process to help catalyze this type of reform? How do different subjects interact with each other over time? Maybe we have a math center and a science center. Maybe one day we have the STEM center, and we can integrate math and science in those types of ways. And then how do schools navigate the process of change? Taking the 4 walls away from a teacher can be a challenging experience for some, and how we navigate that, I think, will be important. So that's School of One. I'd be happy to take any questions you may have. Yes?
One question. I was late because I was giving my closed-school math class a test today. The assessments, they're done at the end of the day, but then is that considered mastery? Or what I'm thinking about is, they can do it right then, but then 3 days later they can't add fractions.
Yeah, great question. We actually looked at this data, and we did find an interesting correlation between, so students took the daily assessment, then they took their post-test. And the skills they learned more recently to the post-test, they tend to do better on than the ones they learned prior. Great point. So what we're going to be doing this go-around is integrating review activities of previously mastered skills into the schedule to mitigate against that happening. Yep.
On the heat map you had, on the post-assessment, you had few that had regressions.
Yeah.
Some of the reds all over the place.
Yeah.
What do you do with those?
Well, we learn from them. I mean, I think ultimately we hope to have the kinds of systems that will help us answer that question readily. Because this was all manual, it was Chris in the closet for 4 days to crank out this information. But ultimately, we want to be able to really understand what happened here. Now, in some cases, look, every item, there's 3 questions. The kid gets 2 out of 3 and then gets 1 out of 3. Maybe they made one little mistake. Maybe they were just tired. You don't want to overread into that. But the hope is that we'll have the systems that can answer that question. Yep.
I noticed that your classrooms only had 7 students. Have you thought about the logistics of having 30 students in a classroom and, one teacher.
Yeah.
How does that?
Well, what we did actually is we used the library, and we had 80 students, and we had 4 teachers. And we had our 4 teacher residents. So it's true that when teachers were delivering live instruction, they may have been sitting at a table with 7 kids. But right behind them were 15 kids working online, and over here were 3 kids working by themselves. So it wasn't like in the room we only had 7 kids. Yes?
What interested in your thoughts on how to, you took one subject, one grade level, a school that had a computer per student, scaling this out such that, because you're going to get into some subjects where it's not a black and white answer, it's a judgment call on the teacher's part as to that's an 80% versus a 20%. Your thoughts on how to scale this out such that schools could implement this?
Well, each of those are different questions. I think when we think about different subjects, in some ways other subjects are easier, in some ways they're harder. They can be easier in the sense that in math, you have to know how to add fractions with like denominators before unlike denominators. You don't have to really know perfectly well, the Revolutionary War to go to the Civil War. So there's a little bit more flexibility in the learning progression. I think, though, all we're trying to do is link content to assessment in whatever that happens to be. And in some places, I think the grain size of the particular skill will be a little bit more understood as it is in math. Some cases it may be broader, but so long as we can link those two things, we think this will be scalable to other subjects quite easily. We want to get the platform right in math because it is more sequential, a little bit easier to do, and there is a fair amount of content out there that we can leverage. But once we have that, we then want to open up to other subjects and leverage that platform to create centers for other content areas.
How are you navigating this with the teachers' unions?
They've been very supportive so far. They said they're going to write about it in their newspaper. They're excited about innovation. They know this is a very hard job, and the fact that we have, meaningful attrition says something, I think, about how we can make this job more sustainable. Do I think down the road we could have a discussion about the right mix of people and systems? Possibly, but that's a different day. Right now, we've got to figure out with the resources we have, how do we make everyone more effective? Yeah.
Joel, this is really interesting. Just 2 points I'd love your thinking on. One is you're working in a system with a fairly rigid curriculum, which is a barrier to lots of learning productivity gain. And so how do you move beyond the domain of just the sort of factual knowledge that's in there to things like learning skills, etc., that will really empower kids to take the big leap? So you're talking about fractions, you're talking about measurements. How do you move to reflective practice, to metacognitive skills, etc., which to me would seem valuable to these kids? The second thing is how do you give control to kids around their own learning? Because if they're getting a playlist every day that says this is what you do, it seems to me you're in fact taking away from control and making it almost like I don't have to think, I just show up.
Very good questions. On the first one, there are a couple of thoughts. One is that it's possible you're not in School of One all day, in math. Maybe this is 75% of math instruction, and the types of skills you're referring to can become the other 25%. It can really free the teacher up to do what systems can't necessarily do. We can also view those types of skills, so long as we can assess them, as skills unto themselves. So this was an important point that came up as we debated this exact question. Teaching a student how to add fractions is different than them really understanding what is the conceptual understanding of a fraction. But the conceptual understanding of a fraction can be a skill in and of itself and can be measured. So long as we can articulate what the skill is and have a way of measuring that, we think we can be as elaborate or otherwise in terms of the systems to do that. On the second question, remind me what it was.
Student
choice. Yeah. So we would love to get to a point where students have choice within the skill. So the next skill in your progression is adding fractions. Pick the lessons you want. here's 25, pick 3, pick whatever you find most interesting. Certainly, it's much better than what it is today, which is teacher can just decide. But we think that the key here is the rigor, and we need the assessments and learning progression to ensure a certain element of rigor. Yeah.
How much work was involved on the back end? I mean, as far as like who was doing with the learning algorithm and the scheduling? Was that teachers, or did you have IT staff? Or,
We had a team in the back office of 12. That included someone who specialized in content and assessment. Chris did a lot of work with the integration of the data. A big pain point for us was materials. I mean, something as basic as if Johnny needs a worksheet number 244 at 11 o'clock, how do you figure out like how he's getting it, where, and how do we, So that was a big thing. So we had a team of 12 doing that, but one of the things we're going to be testing in the next phase is we're having one back office for 3 schools. And we're going to begin to do everything we can to automate as much as what was done previously by machines. Yeah.
What was the aspect of the whole program that didn't work most clearly?
The aspect of the program that didn't work most clearly. I guess I would say that we had high hopes for collaborative content. So you could have 6 kids who are working on an area of a triangle, and they would do some activity together to really help them work as a group on that particular skill. And the challenge was we just didn't have a lot of content out there. I mean, a lot of the stuff that's out there obviously wasn't made for what we're doing. And oftentimes bleeds into different skills, and it's not as atomized as our particular learning progression. So we had to do, we had to get very creative on the content side, particularly when it came to collaborative content than we might otherwise have liked. Oh, let me go here.
A couple of things. Do students have access to their own data? And also, how did you deal with lessons taking different amounts of times? Like you might play a game for 10 minutes and then different
Great
lessons
question.
for 15 hours.
Students had access to their daily assessments every day. They did not have access to, they had access to all their daily assessments. We didn't give them access to their playlist, not because we were hiding it from them, we just sort of couldn't get around to, doing it. The time issue was another sort of very interesting pain point. So you could find a great video on adding fractions. You have a 42-minute class period. The kids finish the video in 6 minutes. What do you do for the rest of the class period? In some cases, we sort of did a little bit of a mashup lesson. So this video goes with this worksheet. Sometimes they would play a game that sort of linked to the skill they worked on. If they were in a piece of software and they did their activity, a lot of the software would have sort of playroom in effect where they could sort of practice other skills. Sometimes we had a library and kids went and got books and read. It wasn't our first choice. But it's something that we are much more cognizant of for this go-around. Yeah.
So I'm interested in like your marketplace / pluggable content model.
Yeah.
So like what kind of content can your current system accommodate? I have something to elaborate, but I just want to hear your answer on that first.
Well, right now we don't have a system, so it's very flexible. I mean, literally, if a kid was going to go to Pearson for some piece of digital content, the device had an image of the Pearson icon. You'd click on the icon. We would pre-assign lesson number 244. The kid would log in with the same password and ID for every content provider and would do that activity. Then the content provider would send us data back, and that would help us improve the model.
Video, or what is it? Is it like a web page? Is it an application?
It could be a web page, could be an online game, could be a video. In some cases, that was deep linked into a particular vendor's website. In some cases, it couldn't be. Chris can talk a little bit more about that particular process. But
we had a repository of metadata describing about 1,200 lessons, and that could include like a URL that they would click and go to the lesson. Or it might say, open this textbook and go to page 44. Or it might be, log on and play this game for 40 minutes, right? So it was a very kind of loose, collection of metadata about the lessons. And then the scheduling algorithm would produce schedules that had those pointers in the student's final schedule. Anything went. Anything that we could fit into a 40-minute lesson and describe in a couple of sentences counted as a lesson.
But the assessment then is separate from the lessons. Like, so the assessment system is your own.
Correct. Well, we used a separate vendor for the assessment, but that was like the referee. So the content vendors would tell us, yeah, Johnny knows fractions, move on. We want a separate assessment to be the referee for whether that was in fact true. Now, I will say ultimately we want to get rid of our assessment, meaning when we can ultimately correlate the data from the content providers to our assessment, there's no need to go content assessment, content assessment, content assessment. So it's like this invisible rigor rule to sort of keep folks honest, but we want to use it as little as we can because it's not a good use of time. Yep.
Have you thought about sort of the arbitrary playlist where, as the student, and I understand that you didn't expose the playlist to the individual students, but if someone says, oh, I mastered the content of playlist element 6, and related to that are 7 and 8 or 12, can I work my own path? And does that jive at all with what you believe the school system to have to do?
Very good question. I'm going to show you. I think I have a good chart that can talk about this a little bit. Okay. This was our clustering map. So going down the side was every skill in our progression. Going across the top were the days the program was in operation. So on this first day, there were 12 kids who needed skill 5A7, as they were on the second day. And over time, and so that shows it's green, because kids would cluster around that skill. And over time, as the program went on, you can see there were lots of 1s and 2s and 3s. Kids fanned out to more and more individual skills as the program went on, which you would expect. But this was a function of having a linear learning progression. We couldn't really solve for the clustering of student needs. So in our next generation, we're now developing a non-linear learning progression so that it'll be less about whether the student can choose to go to different skills and more about if there's 5 different places that a kid can go, we may actually solve for the clustering of students so we could put a teacher there to make more efficient use of the resources. Yep.
One comment, I really have to commend you because some of the skills that students learn in math, critical thinking and problem solving are skills that they will use in other content areas. So it's great that you started with math. My question is, what are some of the challenges you see as you move out into, say, science, where it's inquiry and project-based and labs? What are some of the challenges?
The truth is, we don't know yet. We're really trying to keep our nose to the grindstone on math. At a cursory level, it doesn't seem, as long as you can have accessible skills, this should work. It certainly worked better than the existing industrial model. It's not going to solve all the world's problems and be perfect. But hopefully this can at least complement a lot of the work that really can best be done by great teachers. Yeah.
I've got 2 questions that I'll kind of try to roll into one. With 4 teachers and 4 aides for 80 students, it sounds like this is still 2 to 3 times the teaching classroom resources that we find in the typical U.S. classroom. So how does this compare to other methods, or do you have a way to compare this to other methods of using those resources? And here's where I sort of mentioned part 2. What about resources of things that have been done elsewhere in the world where there have been better outcomes? Is there anything we can learn from that?
So on the first one, the 4 residents were free. So as part of the college students were college students. But more importantly, we do have a sustainability model where we looked at the exact per pupil spending in this school under their current traditional model, and we looked at what it would be under the School of One model. And at the core of it is we think the school could do a better job with 1 fewer teacher and applying those savings toward lots of the technology and the back-end support, and that becomes the long-term sustainability model. Perhaps there may even be more. I don't think we know yet. You could have a model where you have fewer senior teachers who do large live group instruction and an army of early career teachers or college students or high school students who help kids work online. You don't need to be an $80,000 a year teacher. If the kid says, I'm stuck, how can I get help? So we're well aware of the sustainability question, and that's how we're thinking about it. On the second, in terms of what are other countries learning internationally, I don't have a good answer for that. We just haven't looked very closely at that. Others do, and I think the kinds of things that come back to us are, teaching is a more esteemed profession. They don't have these 50 states, 50 standards, 50 tests. A lot of them, you have more, a greater role for a central government, whereas we've got 15,000 school boards and school districts, so it's very hard to sort of get the same kind of coherence in an instructional experience in our country as it might be in other countries. Those are some theories, but I don't think we know the answer to that. Yeah.
Have you thought about at all what would be the implications of this instructional approach on teacher preparation?
We have, and there are a number of them that we think are there. First, the one I mentioned, starting your career in a different modality, tutoring, small group instruction, looking at the data, moving out to large group instruction. But the second is one we've just, in the last couple of months, made a lot of headway on, and it is this concept of the learning progression. What we have done for the next round is we've taken our skill list, which was initially 77 skills, and we've divided it now into 300 skills, all middle school math. So the one that you saw earlier that was like chords and circumferences, that's now 4 different ones. And for each skill on the progression, we've said, okay, what exactly are the precursor skills to this? What are the common misconceptions for this? You would think that after 200 years of doing schools, we just would have this information, but we don't. It just lives in the minds of a handful of great teachers in districts. And the more explicit we can be about why kids may get stuck learning different skills and strategies to help them around those problems, that can really change how we think about preparing teachers for the classroom.
So here we are, the software company, right? We work with you, Chris and Rich, work really deeply with you guys on this. As we're thinking about personalized learning as our vision for education, for one, were you aware of that?
I was.
Okay. For another, what would your wish list be for us to be considering in not just meeting your needs, but scaling this and thinking about not just the U.S., but global needs on this front?
Well, I should say that while we are very excited to have the scale conversation, we're not ready for it. That we really want to get this model right. And we want to go from 1 school to 3 schools to 5 schools, and really want to spend the next 3 years understanding this model at a level before we even talk about, big platforms and scalability and those kinds of things. So our wish list is really for Microsoft to be a partner in that endeavor, and it's less about the technology and more about folks like Rich and Chris that are really embedded in our team and then have a very good sense for what challenges we're trying to solve. I mean, Chris will tell you he's worked in schools for a while and he didn't really fully understand what the day in life of as a teacher. And you think about all the things they have to do. So, and this is not just for School of One. My hope for organizations like Microsoft that want to be interested in personalized learning is to spend time in classrooms, really understand how this all comes to be and how to and building products and supports around classroom workflow. Not the old model we create products and try to figure out how we sell them into schools, but they're really horizontally developed products. They're really designed to make the lives of teachers easier. Yep.
So 2 questions. One is, I have to say, I have a 4-year-old who goes to a Montessori school, and this looks like Montessori on technology, But 2, well, the first question actually, the OECD numbers and the high school graduation rates you numbered, they were done mostly on 15-year-olds. Do you know whether the PISA study in other countries is done with only college-bound students? Because in most countries, they separate students at about age 13 into groups. So that's one question.
I don't.
Okay. And second question is the broader question. So you started out with the 2 pictures of classrooms 100 years ago, and that picture that we all have the image of in our head is of a certain kinds of learning goals, of getting people prepared in a very similar way for life in the 20th century workforce. What are the implications of this type of model for learning goals for the 21st century? I mean, it doesn't on its face necessarily, it's giving people a pretty common set of skills, it looks like.
You're talking about the sort of the 21st century skill movement and those kinds of things?
I had a really interesting question posed about what are our goals for education in the next century? And I'm interested in
So it's a great question, and we would say that there are others that should decide that. That's a policy question. What we can't do is what we've done for the last 25 years, was people, kids are going to learn this, and have no reliable delivery engine to develop those particular skills. So just tell us what you want, kids to learn. That's fine. We want to make sure that we're in the space that can deliver on that particular promise.
I'm curious if you've faced any challenges with data and personally identifiable information, like in terms of student assessments, teacher assessments being shared in a larger audience, data retention, secondary use, that sort of thing.
I should let Chris answer that one. I'd say that we haven't really hit a scale where that's concerned yet. Right now, data retention it's all on my USB key. So, and there's not really any student identifiable information involved. Everything is just a student ID and a skill ID and what their result was, right? So moving forward, that's clearly a big concern, but that's more of like, we see that as a district responsibility. So the New York State Department of Education needs to manage that, LA Unified needs to manage that, and will manage kind of curriculum scheduling and things like that.
So from the overarching the innovation to move from tradition to the old new model, right? And then but still students go to school, right?
Yeah.
So what the major things you want to still keep the four walls there, student in the classroom, versus kind of access anywhere, it's web-based stuff. Why kids go to school? And the second one, I feel that the kids go to school so important that kind of we collaborate all this kind of work together and stuff. And I do not see how here, you said that you focus on personalized stuff, one-to-one. And then how students interact with each other in this kind of environment. So when the purpose for go to school, and then they support one not go to school, right? The kid can stay at home. I have this second grader, right? He's read book at home and then do the AR from home, connect to school, right? He doesn't have to do that at school. That's super.
I mean, we view, collaborative learning experiences as critical to the learning process. It is a modality.
You capture all your skills?
Sure. So long as the four of us can all work on area of a triangle, we can collectively do an activity because that's what we're ready to work on at that time. We're working together, but it's purposeful. I mean, a lot of times what's happening in schools is a lot of the collaborative activities degenerate into mush very easily.
Then how you program, since from math, each student pick their playlist or the skills, how you support those kind of groups?
Well, for each of the skills, we have all the modalities. So for area of a triangle, we have online lessons, live teacher-delivered lessons, collaborative lessons. And if we can cluster enough kids around a particular skill where that modality would work, those students can work on that type of a collaborative activity.
Has this effort spurred content makers to start mapping kind of different, to your point, your skill-based lessons? I would imagine, like, do you have a video and a collaborative environment for every skill, or some skills you just have one option, and is then you're able to showcase that with content developers for them to provide and develop to meet your needs?
So this is one place where it's helpful to be, New York City, because we either are their biggest customer or could be their biggest customer. So they wanna play, and we haven't yet seen custom development for this. I don't think we're sort of big enough yet to do that, with the exception of the Games for Learning Institute. We're also now working with PBS and looking to raise funding. So what the Games for Learning folks were doing with games, they want to do with videos. They're going to sort of get the makers of Sesame Street to say, let's do a great 6.5-minute video on area of a triangle. Or something for older kids, whatever the case may be. So that's our sort of next initiative on the content development side, is to try to work with PBS on that kind of content. But there's also a growing amount of free content out there. Even in the last few months, we've just been amazed by what we've been able to find. I think our challenge is to try to get content wherever we can. We're at a stage now where it's more about quantity, and then once we sort of fill our repository, we can cull out the bottom 10% every year and improve the quality. We still have a screen, but hopefully that bar can go higher and higher. Yep.
You briefly mentioned free schools. Can you just elaborate on what your next steps are? I think you had a couple slides that you skipped over.
Yeah. What's next? Let's see here. Here's what we want to accomplish in the spring. We want to test our nonlinear learning progression, figure out a multi-school support model, more robust technology, improve our content, continue to show the directionally positive academic outcomes, teacher and student satisfaction, and our long-term sustainability plan. We plan to be in 3 schools starting in February. We've selected those schools, and we're already off to the races in preparing for that. That will be from February to April. And then in May, one of those schools, this will flip in and be the math program in that school. And that'll give us 2 months of how does this work in a school. And one of the biggest questions on this gets to the question of how can Microsoft help and where this is going. One of the biggest questions for personalized learning has to do with the very concept of the schedule. How do you sort of manage an entire school day and think about the optimization of resources when it comes to this constraint of time? We'll begin to learn a little bit about that with our in-school model. Hopefully we'll learn enough that by the fall we'll be in 3 and then ultimately 5 schools in January as the in-school model for math, and then we'll move to between 10 and 20 the following year. This is going to be run out of a newly created nonprofit organization that's affiliated with the Department of Education, but that is going to be positioned so that this can ultimately scale far beyond New York City. Yeah.
Did I originally hear that the model was based on a school where it was one-to-one technology, there's 1 computer per kid in the school?
When we selected our pilot sites and the next round of sites, we made that a requirement. And there are a number of middle schools in New York that already have that.
That's provided by the Department of Education?
Yes.
In New York City?
Yes. So there's called a one-to-one movement. And one of the challenges with the one-to-one movement is there's not an instructional model that really leverages it. So we're at this place where we all know technology, it's one of these sort of mismatch things. Look at all the great things technology can do, but who's making it happen? So we think that one of the things this can do to the benefit of organizations like Microsoft is to create the demand for one-to-one. It's not just for the sake of the technology, but actually to really optimize the model. You need 1 computer for every kid because that's what will enable the kind of personalized learning. Now, I should say, over time, we may explore 2-to-1s or 3-to-1s. They won't be as effective. It'll be harder to schedule because that'll be just one more constraint we've got to work around. But we want to help to create that demand.
Kind of asking the other, as we kind of design the scheduling, we're doing it in like a resource constraint model. So we're saying, this is how many teachers we have, this is how many computers that we have, this is how many unique spaces we have. But all those are kind of configurable things. So if we knew that we only had a 2-to-1 ratio, there's nothing intrinsically that changes in the way the program works. It just means that at any given time we schedule half the kids for live instruction, and that just kind of falls out of the system.
And maybe you sort of just answered that, but is that schedule based on the number of teachers that you described in this last pilot year, the 4 to 80 with the 4 student residents?
Is it the schedule?
Yeah, I mean, do you still keep that same student-teacher ratio and all the 12 people working the data, or hopefully that data?
Yeah, it'll be, the enrollment will be whatever, well, for the after-school programs, we'll have it'll be the same, roughly 80 kids per school. The in-school model, it'll be whatever the school happens to have. There are 206 graders. We have 200 kids. If the school has 7 teachers, we've got 7 teachers. So we'll work with whatever resources already exist in the school. We're not, in the next 3 years, looking for any labor savings. We're really solving for what works. Once we figure that out, we'll figure out the best way to support the economics. Yeah.
So all of these assessments could be possibly replacing the state-administered assessment?
Good question. Not for a while.
I mean, isn't that a goal of this at the end of the day, that we are doing organic assessment build day by day and there is no need to do it again?
So long as you can validate the data you're getting in one system and correlates to your high stakes one, it's a waste of time to do the high stakes one. My guess is it'll be a while before we get the states there, but we'd love to begin to lay the pipes to do that.
Millions of dollars wrapped up in contracts.
Yeah. There's a lot of freeze on that.
Any other questions? We're just about out of time. Great. Well, thank you all so much. Really appreciate it. Thank you.